Thank you all. Let me welcome you to this IISS discussion meeting on Iran, the United States, and the Middle East as viewed from Jerusalem and Washington. This is one of a semi-regular series of discussion meetings that discusses various aspects of a country whose name is not in the title of this session, but you'll all have guessed that. Oh, no, I'm sorry, it's right the first word. What am I talking about? Iran, yes. Okay, so we're grateful that you all came this last day before a four-day weekend. It's scheduled today because we wanted to take advantage of a visit to London by Dr. David Menashri, who is Israel's premier expert on Iran, and well, it goes beyond Israel's premier expert. He's a world-renowned Iran expert. He's currently president of the College of Law and Business in Israel. He was the founding director of the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies. He held a chair for modern Iranian history at Tel Aviv University, and more. But you get the point. He'll lead off this discussion today. He's not going to focus on the nuclear issues per se. He's more of a historian and a political analyst, but he'll paint a picture that will contribute to our understanding of the nuclear issues. David Allen will then speak. David is my colleague here at IISS.
His name's Dana, not David.
I said Dana. I'm sure I did.
No, you say David, doesn't matter.
I can't believe I said that. I've screwed up twice. Can I start over? Dana Allen is my colleague. He's the editor of Survival, and he's a senior fellow for transatlantic relations. He's been following the Iran issue for some years. He and Stephen Simon wrote a very good book 4 years ago called The Sixth Crisis, Iran, Israel, America, and the Rumors of War. And he and Steve have been working on a follow-up book, which I look forward to. So without any further mistakes on my part, I'm going to ask Dr. Menashri to kick us off. I don't know if you want to speak from the podium or, okay. If you could keep it to about 15, but you can go over a little bit. So.
Thank you. I'll go from here. I arrived last night after midnight. Because I want to avoid arriving this morning and the chance of missing you. A word about the title. It is Iran, Israel, the United States, and the Middle East. Viewed, I'm glad that's put viewed from Jerusalem and Washington. Initially, when I gave one lecture about a view from Tel Aviv, because I wanted to distinct myself from Jerusalem, because I'm not spokesperson of the government, and I said I'm Tel Aviv University, so the view from Tel Aviv. Someone remarked that I don't recognize Jerusalem to be the capital city of Israel, so I asked this time to put it Jerusalem rather than Tel Aviv, but it's still my views and not any view of the government that I cannot claim to represent. And it was, I think Mark pointed rightly that it will be not appropriate for me to come to your institution and speak about the area that you are so good at, about proliferation and nuclear issues. And so to be safe, I decided to speak about issues that I believe I understand something in. It's about Iran. Not that I know. I studied Iran more than 40 years, and sometimes I get the impression that the more you study, the less you understand this country, because it's so difficult really to penetrate into the politics of this society. So let me begin with the obvious. Iran is a complex country. Now, I know it's obvious, but it took the world a long time to understand that there is no one face to Iran. It's not entirely good, not entirely bad. There are many, many other colors in between. And I'll try in my talk to focus on this issue. But let me begin with three, I think, questions that are important in understanding Iran and are not, I think, sufficiently understood. The first is, we claim, we call the revolution Islamic revolution, Islamic republic, Islamic terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism. Everything is Islamic. I think it's time that one asks himself to what degree the revolution in Iran in 1979 and what is going on since then in Islamic revolution, in what sense the origin of this movement was Islamic. Now, of course, in Islam, everything falls under the title of religion. In Islam, in Judaism, religion covers all our life, but if you ask what led people in Iran to join the revolution, was the desire to establish an Islamic Republic of Iran? I doubt it. I lived in Iran the last 2 years of the Shah's rule. I saw the people going to the streets, and what they demanded, that they were dreaming for, was not exactly to establish Islamic theocracy or the Islamic Republic. It was, I think that the struggle was on two main issues, or two and a half. One was social justice, and the other was political justice. And for me, this was the main reason. To give the young generation better life than the life of their parents. In a way, there is not much difference between the struggle of the Iranians in '79 and what we have seen in the Arab Spring in Cairo and other places in the Middle East. So for me, it's important to understand, because the main root of the revolution was on two issues: liberties and welfare, bread and freedom. And I say two and a half, there is another point. It was respect, dignity of the Iranians. And it is no surprise that one of the slogans of President Rouhani during his election campaign, he promised the young people of Iran to give them back the value of the rial and the value of your passport. It's really very meaningful when a candidate for the presidency speaks about giving back the value of the rial, the currency of the Iranians, and the value of the passport, to make Iran a respected nation among the nations of the world. The second question is to what degree the ideology of the revolution was Islamic. Of course it was Islamic, but there is more than one understanding of Islamic ideology. And I think it was phrased best by Abdul Karim Soroush 20 years ago when he said, there is no one understanding of Islam, there is no one understanding that is better than the other, there is no final understanding of Islam, and he very courageously added, and there can be no official understanding of Islam or interpretation of Islam. Different ayatollahs, different groups, different individuals have different interpretation. And in Islam, has a place, mainly in Shiite Islam, to different interpretations. Just to give you an example, when Ayatollah Khomeini came back victorious from exile, first in Iraq and then a few months in Paris, and many people think he lived in Paris all his life. He spent 14 years in Iraq. He came back victorious to Iran and established the Islamic Republic of Iran. There have been 7 grand Ayatollahs in Iran at that time. None of them supported Ayatollah Khomeini's interpretation of Islam. The number one Ayatollah in Iran at that time, Ayatollah Shariat Madari, was forced into house arrest until he passed away 7 years after. The man that Ayatollah Khomeini prepared to be his successor, Ayatollah Montazeri, spent his last 4 or 5 last years of life under house arrest. It means that even within this group of Islamists or supporter of Ayatollah Khomeini or Shiite Islam in Iran, there are different interpretations. And the third question is to what degree the policy of this regime conforms with the ideology with which Ayatollah Khomeini came to power 35 years ago. 35 already. Well, like any other revolution in history, there is a difference between what people, leaders, say in opposition and what they do while they are in power. Probably in your country they do exactly what they promised, but in most cases, the new governments really have to tackle the realities of life. And now confronted with their harsh realities of life, they had to make concessions. And I can tell you very clearly, in each and every case, almost in each, to be safe, almost in each and every case, that there was a clash between ideology and interest of the state, of interest of the revolution, of interest of Islam, interest as the ruling elite interpreted it, wherever there was a clash, interest won over ideology. I could give you examples from here to end of the day, and I wonder if one can give an example to the contrary. The one that I know that there was the Iranian pursued their policy regardless of the fact that it was not good for their interests, was their Salman Rushdie affair. But usually you don't have to see Iran. Now, it doesn't mean that the Islamic leader wakes up in the morning and says, well, what can I do today against what I promised? They want to do what they promised. But when there is a clash between the two, they opt for the interest. And interest can be defined differently by different people, but generally speaking, they follow the national interests of Iran, I would say. Ayatollah Khomeini in opposition said there is no difference between Muslims. All of us are Arabs, Baluch, Turks, Kurds, we are all Muslims. When he came to power, probably the first decision in foreign policy was how you call this Gulf of water between the Arabs and the Iranians. The Persians call it Khalij Fars, the Arabs call it Al-Khalij al-Arabi, and Khomeini decided it will be called the Persian Gulf. And when Ayatollah Khalkhali, one of the people who later on became defined as reformist, it was very radical at the beginning, but come back to this, how people transform, suggested to call the Gulf of the Muslims, Khomeini refused. He said the Gulf has been Persian and will remain Persian. And they teach Hafez, the poetry with full of wine and women, and they do what they're supposed to do to run properly the country. Now, how far you can retreat from your dogma, in what price, and in what field, in what speed, there are many different voices. And I think this is the main issue dividing between groups that we call fundamentalists, radicals, conservatives, I don't know how you term them, and the other group that we usually call reformist, pragmatic. I don't call them moderates, but reformists would be good. You can call them liberals, whatever. Everything is relative. Let me say a word about the more pragmatic element, reformist element, before we go to Rouhani. I think there is a wonderful civil society in Iran. If you look at their newspapers, when they are allowed to be published, you see wonderful newspapers publishing and penetrating articles and stories, and which is wonderful to read. I read Persian, I read Arabic, and I compare the newspapers in Iraq under Saddam and the Iranian newspapers under Khatami. There is a huge difference. I was speaking like this in Jerusalem many years ago, and one of our officials asked me how you can speak about even relative freedom of speech in Iran when 100 liberal newspapers were shut down in 5 years. He gave me the answer. He asked, where is another country in the Middle East which has 100 liberal newspapers to shut them down? If you shut down 100 liberal, it's meaningful. Now, Iran is not paradise, but look at women. 70 years ago, there was not a single girl in Iranian university. Today, they are 60% of the student population in Iran. This is an irreversible process. Cinema industry, the arts that you see in Iran, the young generation in Iran, and you see their struggle for freedom. I think that book publications, the books published in Iran, again, when they are allowed to be published. An Iranian friend told me that his definition of freedoms in Iran, say, you know, they say we don't have freedom of speech. That's not true. We have freedom of speech. What we don't have is freedom after speech. So it's, they publish, they go to jail, they come back and they continue the struggle. And I have a lot of respect for the young people of Iran and civil society in Iran and the promise in them for the better future of Iran. But the problem is that the power in Iran does not rest in the hands of these people. It is in the hands of the other group that usually are more radical, conservative, fundamentalists, whatever you prefer to term them. Now, here we have Rouhani being elected, and there are different views. I know that both in my country and other countries, what is the meaning of Rouhani being elected? What is the promise for change? Well, I know all the what is being said in Iran. The elections are not free. In Iran, the president is not the head of the state. Power rests with the supreme leader, constitutionally and practically. Rouhani himself is not moderate. Rouhani will give you quotes about what he said in the past. And let me say something about what people said in the past in Iran. All the people that today we call them reformists, liberals, moderates, started with Ayatollah Khomeini to be ultra-radicals. When I hear that Khalkhali is being referred to as moderate, or Karoubi, or Mousavi, I can give you all these names. These people have been, not only people get old, revolutions also mature. And in due time, they change their attitudes. And this is something that happened also in Iran. So the fact that Rouhani 20 years ago, 10 years ago said something, I don't think this is the yardstick to judge his policy. But on the other hand, I think that I believe it is a very meaningful process and meaningful change, not because of Rouhani himself, and I would not refer to him as moderate. And I can tell you that I was very upset about what he said about the Holocaust when he was asked during his visit to New York what he says about his predecessor views about the Holocaust, denial of Holocaust, and he said, I'm not an historian, I'm a politician. I didn't like this kind of remark. There are other better ways to respond to such a question. But I think it's regardless of Rouhani, the movement that brought him to the presidency, the resentment of the people, the struggle of the young people of Iran, and go and see where did he gain his main support. It was not in Qom, not even in Tehran. It was in Baluchistan, in Kurdistan, in the most remote places in Iran, and among the young people who are really dissatisfied with his revolution. He became the symbol of change, the hope for change. And in this sense, I think his election was important. He also gained some support from Khamenei to pursue his more moderate policy on the nuclear issue, and less so a bit about the attitude towards the West. Now, it is important to understand that Rouhani was not elected to destroy the revolution. He was elected to save the revolution from itself. So if someone thinks that here is Rouhani and tomorrow he is beginning to do things to destroy the revolution, I don't think this is the case. The change originated from dissatisfaction, displeasure, hardships, the economy, the currency, unemployment, the number of graduates of university and the number of jobs that are not available in the market, the urge for bread and freedom, the main issues, the fact that Iran has been isolated and it was treated the way it was treated. But also in the regional policy of Iran, they saw that they are isolated. The main allies of Iran, the main friends of Iran were President Chavez of Venezuela and Hafez al-Assad and then Bashar al-Assad in Syria. This is not something that the young people of Iran like. And then what happened in Syria with the chemical weapons being used disappointed them even more, and they found themselves with Syria on one side and Hezbollah on the other side, confronted with the world on the issue of nuclear policy, and this was other reasons for them to rethink their policy. And then there was the Arab Spring. You know, many people ask me, well, why there is no Arab Spring in Iran? Well, the obvious question is Iran is not an Arab country, so there is no Arab Spring. But if you look deeply, the copyright on this phenomenon of the Arab Spring was made in Iran. Iran is the only country in the Middle East until the Arab Spring in which people really involved in policy and made their policy. Iran is the only country in the Middle East that had two big revolutions in the 20th century. 1906, the constitutional revolution. People in Iran went to claim constitution, and they gained revolution. The constitution has changed in substance, but the concept of constitutionalism remained. And Iran is the only country which had so far Islamic revolution. In between, they had two other. One is maybe more familiar to the people in Britain, the Mossadegh movement and before that in the late 19th century. You don't have many countries that in which people have been so deeply involved in making their policy. And then when Iranians ask themselves, where is the Arab Spring came from, both conservative and moderates would tell you it is made in Iran. The difference is that the conservatives say that the Arab Spring is belated response to the 1979 revolution. The reformists would say this is a response to the 2009 young movement in Iran. But both of them agree that the idea of people going to the streets and changing policy came from Iran, and there is some, I think, justice in what they claim. So Iran is isolated, Syria is isolated, the threat of the Arab Spring is in the neighborhood. And here what I think happened is that ultimately President Obama and President Rouhani found each other as good allies because of the weakness of both sides. President Obama wished to have relations with Iran. This was his main issue in his first elections and also in the second election. If not the main, it was one of the main issues, dialogue with Iran. And here is Rouhani looking for hope, for change. I think the fact that until now, whenever one of them was strong, he refused to speak with the other, and vice versa. Last year, for the first time, I think, that both sides found themselves in such a miserable situation that they were willing to do whatever it takes, almost whatever it takes, to find a solution between them. Still, it's not going to be easy. Iranian policy, as I said before, it's not ideological. And that's what I think it can be changed. Iran responds to pressure, unlike what many people thought that, well, sanctions would not help. I think this is one thing that Israel can claim success, is that moving the world about to pressure Iran more and more, believing that pressure can help. And I believe that the only way that you can really change is to pressure Iran. And that's, I think, was in the background of the background of the discussion and agreements that we had so far. If you look at Syria, for example, what brings Syria and Iran together? Iran is the most Islamic country in the Middle East, having its best relations with the most, I would say, one of the most secular regimes in the Middle East, Ba'athist, Arab nationalist countries. So what's the common? Well, we know that politics make strange bedfellows, but here I think that the two extreme sides join together and see policy of Iran towards Syria. In Syria, while in Bahrain, they support the people against the government in their own view. In Syria, they support the government against their people. So what is the ideology, what is the ideological side about it rather than pure interest? I don't want to go far to Nagorno-Karabakh, in which Azerbaijani Shiites were fighting with Christian Armenians, and Iran supported the Azeris rather than supported the Christians rather than the Shiites. Now, if I ask you what is more difficult for Iran to digest, to make concessions on the nuclear issue or to speak with the United States? Many people that I ask them, usually they say, well, to make concession on the nuclear issue would be much more difficult. I beg to differ. I think for Iran to sit with the Americans is much more difficult than making concessions on the nuclear issue. For one reason, obvious reason, any concession or almost any concession on the nuclear issue, certainly concessions that they are willing to do, is reversible. One picture of Ayatollah Khamenei with President Obama, this is irreversible. For an Islamic regime who made America to be such a huge enemy of the United States, to make such concession is impossible. And that's why, although the Americans wish to have some handshake in September in the UN Assembly in New York, the Iranians didn't like it. And you go back and see what was the welcome ceremony for Rouhani and Zarif when they came back to Iran. They were criticized on two issues. The telephone call between Obama and Rouhani, and the long and friendly meeting between Kerry and Zarif. So the gap still remains because the main enemy, in the view of the Iranian regime, the main enemy is the United States. We, Israel, are only the small Satan. Well, America is the great Satan. I have a few minutes here to speak about Israel. We can leave it later. 3 minutes. Now, why the Iranians are so hostile against Israel? I would say that in case, unlike in many other issues, the ideological rejection of Israel, and I don't want to go deeply into it, why ideologically Israel should not exist. On the other hand, they don't have any good practical reason to retreat. In many ways, the animosity to Israel helps Iran in its domestic and regional policy. If you want to be the leader of the Muslim world, you have to raise the flag of Palestine. If you want to explain why economic difficulties are such harsh, it's always good for the revolution to have an enemy away from their, far from their country. There is a Persian phrase, they say that a low wall. Israel is a low wall that can step over it. In a way, I would say that the Israelis are also using Iran in many ways as a low wall to attribute all the problems to them, and you have to find excuse for difficulties. You say Iran, 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 and the Iranian nuclear program, and this is good excuse for everything. Israeli policy on Iran was, we were in really dilemma in Israel. For many years, I claimed that Israel should not speak about the Iran nuclear issue because when we speak about it, we make the world believe that this is exclusively the problem of Israel. But on the other hand, if you don't speak about it, the world will forget. So how you go in between these two extremes? I think that the government spoke too much. I think that currently they are speaking less. And I think that they are speaking less because after what happened with Syria, with the chemical weapon, I think many people understood that if the United States is not going to do anything in Syria, it's not likely they will do something with Iran. And I think in many ways it came back home that this military option, although it is on the table, it's something that it will be very, very difficult to be used, and I hope no one will come to this conclusion that he has to use the policy. I'm glad that I don't have much time to speak about the Israeli policy, otherwise it's being recorded here and reported back, and I still want to go back home. But I think that the dilemma that I mentioned is a very serious dilemma. And for the Iranians who have been really more pious more Palestinian than the Palestinians. Let me teach you another phrase in Persian. They say that Iran has turned to be a plate which is warmer than the soup. When you have soup which is warm, the plate is not warmer. I think in the Christian world would say that it's becoming more pious than the Pope. And there are Iranian intellectuals who raise this issue. Why we became more Palestinian than the Palestinian? Why it became a plate which is warmer than the soup? And the final word, when I look about possibility of change in Iran, I think that this kind of change of government between Ahmadinejad, Khatami, Ahmadinejad, Rouhani, this is something that I think it's part of the Iranian policy. They go one way one time, another way another time. I didn't mention in my talk the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, and other elements of power in Iran, but the basic power is in the hands of the more conservatives. What brings hope for change is the young people of Iran, and I think that ultimately this will happen. When, I don't know. When the people one day raise and start moving in new direction, I don't know. They tried in 1999, they tried in 2009, they will try it again. Because I think that with the tradition of the Iranians and with this maturity of young people in Iran and the tradition of social and political change in Iran, ultimately they will come. When this happens, I know that all experts will say, of course I knew it will come, the sign was on the wall, don't believe them. Because I'm an historian, I can tell you, no one knows what will happen tomorrow. We didn't predict the fall of the Shah, we didn't predict the fall of Gaddafi, Mubarak, and others, and I don't think we can claim this wisdom to know what will happen tomorrow. But looking at the past, one thing is clear, that the solution, the decision, on the direction that Iran will go rest with the young people of Iran, because only they will be able to make their history and to shape the policy of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. You've done something unique. You've left us all with a sense of optimism about Iran. I never talk about Iran and come up optimistic, so thank you. Dana, let's see what you say from the point of view of Washington.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to David's remarks, and mine are going to be, in a certain sense, more about the sort of meta-controversies involving the Obama administration's policies towards Iran and the Middle East more generally. Sort of, you could say, Obama and his critics obviously are in Jerusalem, they're in Riyadh, and they're in Washington, among other places. Mark is right that what I'm talking about are based on research and writings in collaboration with my colleague Stephen Simon, and I should add the usual disclaimer that he's not responsible for anything stupid that I say. Let me start with a simple characterization of the Obama presidency, particularly vis-a-vis the Middle East, as realist and reluctant. Realist is obviously in the administration's own self-conception, but I'd also argue that's a fairly reasonable, that it's true in the sense that there's a fairly reasonable fixation from the president himself on finding a sustainable balance between American interests, ambitions on the one hand, and American resources on the other. It is reluctant to use military force. Now, this reluctance is mixed with an understanding that military force is sometimes necessary, and on this subject you should always go back for reference to read President Obama's Nobel Peace Prize speech, which in the circumstances of the time he kind of decided should be a Nobel War Prize speech, and that's kind of the speech he gave. Still, the president and polls suggest the American people have learned the lessons of the Bush-era wars, and they've learned them well. They've learned them deeply. Whether they've overlearned them is, as many of their critics suggest, is something that we can discuss. At this point, I always introduce an important qualification. Obama administration's strategy in the Middle East can only be called a retrenchment or a withdrawal in comparison to the George W. Bush administration. I mean, from an historical point of view, I think all the Obama administration thinks it's doing is going back to the norm, the kind of American strategic posture that you had, from the Reagan administration from the Nixon administration to the Reagan administration, and before and after. I made this point at a workshop last week at Chatham House. And I was challenged on this argument by saying, yes, that may be true, but you can't go back. We live in a different world. And it's deluded to think we can go back to the conditions of the Reagan or the Nixon administrations. I don't know if it's deluded, but it's certainly, I think in certain respects, it's what the Obama administration is trying to do. Now, this administration has plenty of critics, as I said at the outset, in Jerusalem, in Riyadh, and in Washington, which is an interesting kind of unholy tripartite alliance, if you think about it. But these critics consider the current American foreign policies not to be realist, but to be feckless. And this critique involves a kind of theory of leadership and American credibility that I don't personally find convincing, but I do take it seriously. And I think, in a way, David, although I don't think I'd put David in the camp in Jerusalem that I'm talking about, but nonetheless, David did mention one of the arguments. It's a theory that holds, in effect, that it was important to bomb Syria last summer, even if there was a peaceful way to rid the country of chemical weapons, because the international signaling of credibility does not allow for subtle points about what is actually more effective in getting rid of those weapons. And the international signaling of credibility also does not allow for arguments about opportunity costs that I'd make. I'd actually say that military action in Syria would make the United States less likely to intervene militarily against Iran because there are opportunity costs, and in the same way that arguably the intervention in Libya has had a certain inhibiting effect on our policy in Syria. As it happens, we actually have a pretty good natural experiment on the question of military force and credibility. Although I have to tell you at the outset that the results of this experiment are ambiguous. In summer 2003, Iran's leaders looking east and west saw violently toppled regimes and American troops. And I think it's fairly reasonable to conclude that these observations, this perspective from Tehran, had something to do with the proposal that was transmitted to Washington for a kind of grand bargain. It was a proposal that the Bush administration did not take up. David Menashri is much better qualified than I am to judge whether it was a viable proposal and with what degree of backing from the supreme leader and so forth. But based on my limited knowledge, I do think it was in some measure serious. 10 years later, in the summer of 2013, Tehran was looking at a very different U.S. administration that had withdrawn those troops from Iraq and largely from Afghanistan, that had actively restrained Israeli military action against Iran. I mean, a slight complication is the Bush administration did too. But the difference between the two was that the Obama administration was palpably reluctant to use force, as I said at the outset. What the Obama administration had done, though, was it had organized a pretty remarkable international coalition for the purposes of economic pressure with prodding from Israel, as David said. This, all through the Obama administration, there was a technically live, sometimes it seemed moribund bid for U.S.-Iranian dialogue, and this bid had gone really back to the Obama campaign of 2008, in which Obama expressed his desire for this dialogue. And there were, of course, a lot of pitfalls along the way. But by last summer, the Americans and the Iranians were engaged in serious negotiations leading to the interim agreement now being implemented. So, as I say, this is a natural experiment with ambiguous results. U.S. overwhelming force, the use of U.S. overwhelming force in 2003 led to a promising bid that went nowhere except for the spinning of a lot more centrifuges. U.S. diplomacy and economic pressure and military reluctance and eagerness for engagement led to an interim agreement last fall. That certainly doesn't solve the problem. And the further negotiations may have at best a 50% chance of solving the problem. But again, the results are ambiguous. But I will say one thing regarding my own theory of American leadership and credibility. In an encounter like this, the long-running encounter between the United States and Iran, you have to be, from the American point of view, I think you have to be able to imagine a solution that does not entail the abject surrender of the other side. And, that's the imagination that I think the administration or President Obama certainly possesses, and that I don't perceive his more hawkish critics as possessing. I mean, maybe I'm being unfair to them, or maybe I'm wrong about my central premise. Let me say something about the American politics of these issues, because I always err on the side of believing that politics are important. I mean, there's sometimes an analysis that says, the political debate is a lot of noise and we always resolve to a certain kind of mainstream American policy. I'm not sure I believe that. And in any event, we are now 2 years and 6 months away from the next U.S. presidential election. I think I got that right. So we're increasingly into a phase where we have to talk about Obama legacies rather than Obama policies, Obama strategies. On the politics, I'd highlight two interesting phases, which are suggestive of a future constellation, but I don't draw any definitive conclusions about where they're leading. The first one is the Israeli Prime Minister's intervention in American presidential politics in the run-up to the 2012 election. The Israeli Prime Minister made clear his preference, and I think tried to leverage that preference into affecting the election in favor of the president's challenger. Now, I don't suggest we should pull out the smelling salts about this. Peter Beinart, whom I admire and who is no great fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu, has written on this saying, essentially, let's get real. We are not children. We are not political virgins. The George H.W. Bush administration made it pretty clear that it wanted to see the end of the Shamir government in Israel, and the Shamir government in Israel ended. So we don't need to get so indignant. Of course, the big difference is that Netanyahu failed, if my interpretation of his efforts were correct. And that is suggestive about the future political constellation in the United States. And I don't have time really to talk about it. It's part of the subject of a lot of work I'm doing. But the sense that there may be something changing in, well, you know, again, it's a long argument. We can argue that, you know, under such circumstances, an Israeli prime minister would have always failed. But the point is he failed this time, and that, you know, in a certain sense, in terms of, I mean, I know there are leaders of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States who think that this was a big strategic mistake, suggesting that the emperor has no clothes now. That's one phase. The next phase is going to be the Republican primary process, which is going to start sooner than you can imagine. And here you have a very interesting debate. And again, I don't want to suggest that it's going to end with any other kind of Republican candidate than we're used to. But you have a very interesting debate driven by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, who, by certain measures, and I know I'm being recorded and I really need to strictly limit the meaning of what I'm saying, but by certain sort of material measures, you could make a case that he's the front runner right now. It has to do with his father's network in Iowa and New Hampshire, the possibility of a very boring Democratic primary process anointing Hillary Clinton, which will lead a lot of young leftist, libertarian, Democratic voters to cross over in the primaries and vote for Rand Paul. I mean, there are all sorts of interesting possibilities. I just want to read something that Rand Paul said about the Iranian nuclear issue a few days ago. This is what he said. They said, he was referring to people who are hardliners on the Iranian nuclear issue. They said containment will never, ever be our policy. He was talking about people who oppose Iran getting nuclear weapons at any cost. We woke up one day and Pakistan had nuclear weapons. If that would have been our policy toward Pakistan, we would be at war with Pakistan. We woke up one day and China had nuclear weapons. We woke up one day and Russia had them. The people who say, by golly, we will never stand for that, they are voting for war. You know, I referred to certain measures where you could call him at this point the front runner. Just to quote a really excellent commentator on U.S. politics, Jonathan Chait, on the Rand Paul phenomenon, he says, Paul has developed shrewd instincts and has obvious political talent. He may or may not successfully finesse the staggeringly large gulf between his worldview and that of the party he is trying to take over. But stopping people like Paul from capturing the nomination is the reason the party establishment exists. So, you know, that's to draw a certain degree of skepticism around any idea that this man could become the Republican nominee. All I'm trying to suggest, though, is you could have a fairly interesting debate on the Republican side. And conceivably, you could have a Republican candidate who, on issues of war and peace, would stand to the left of the Democratic candidate, not who we imagine to be Hillary Clinton. I actually don't think that's going to happen, but it's not impossible. I'm out of time. I do want to say since I started off talking about a realist Obama administration, which is focusing on a narrower definition or trying to focus on a more sustainable definition of U.S. national interests, it's worth raising, this raises a fair question, which is why then has so much time and energy been devoted by this administration, specifically by the current Secretary of State, to the Israel-Palestine peace process, a process that a majority of analysts expected to fail and what now appears to be in the process of failing, that is this current bid. And as I say, this is a more than a fair question. So in conclusion, I want to try to give an approximation of an answer, actually 3 answers. First of all, anything having to do with the United States and Israel is going to run up fairly quickly against the limits of a realist analysis of U.S. foreign policy. Israel is just not another foreign state. It's more in some weird, well, not weird, but in some unusual aspects of U.S. domestic political dynamics, it's more like the 51st state of the United States. So it gets inordinate support, but it also gets inordinate moral scrutiny. And I mean, that's an argument, that's a statement that a lot of people in a London audience, I think, would find very surprising. And I'm happy to defend it in the Q&A. But my point is both can be true at once. Israel gets a lot of unthinking U.S. support, but it also gets more scrutiny than in moral human rights terms than a lot of other countries would get. Second, of course, a case can be made for the strategic importance of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This was the assumption of President Obama's initial big speech on this issue, his speech in Cairo in, when was it, June 2009. It's a common view among U.S. military officers that this is important to us for our overall position in the Middle East, that solving the Israel-Palestine conflict would, in fact, save the lives of American soldiers. A retired Israeli general I spoke to has called this the CENTCOM view of the world. This retired Israeli general is a genuine dove on these issues, but he didn't mean it as a compliment, actually. The third point I'd make is on this issue, you might, I don't know how far I want to take this, but you might make the case that, in a certain sense, actions speak louder than words, and in fact, the Obama administration has not made the choice to invest the kind of political capital that might be required to pressure particularly Israel on this case, even though it must have been tempted to do so. So I've just engaged in what lawyers call arguing in the alternative. Realists defined vital national interests are not relevant to American policy towards Israel. The two-state solution is in fact a vital American interest. The Obama administration has not in fact invested the kind of political and strategic capital that indicates a vital American interest. 3 alternatives, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dana. I couldn't help but contrast what David was talking about, Rouhani saying on the campaign trail, and you saying about Rand Paul saying on the pre-campaign trail. We've got about 12 minutes for discussion. Let me start off, if I may, and then I'll get to Olivia and others. I'm sorry, Nazanin. David, I was really cheered by the thought that it's easier for Iran to strike a deal, make concessions on the nuclear issue than it is to sit down with the United States. That's cheerful because the United States doesn't really care about sitting down with Iran. What they want to do is strike a nuclear deal. But since you talk so much about, Iran focuses on interests, and I know you said you're not a nuclear expert here, but a lot of what would be required for those concessions would involve Iran's interest in having a potential strike capability. But do you think that can be overcome? And then I guess a related question is, the facts on the ground change. The United States and Iran are now talking, so they've established a relationship. And so in a way it is already becoming irreversible.
My point, and I made it, that Iran responds to pressure. And in order to let them strike a deal, and what kind of deal, they have to consider the alternatives. And that's, I think that the policy is, it is a realpolitik. Some of my friends tell it's a realpolitik, which the currency politics, but it's really, the Iranians are very good in making a policy which is faithful and help their interests. You have to show them the interest. And I think that part of the reason that they agreed to come to this negotiating table with the 5+1 was the fact that the domestic difficulties facing them, and they were looking for a way out of the misery. So, yes, but then the pressure can be different ways. One thing that I didn't mention in my talk, that doesn't relate to the nuclear issue, but it ultimately will have to do with the nuclear issue. If you want to show the Iranians resentment of how the world feels about human rights in Iran, you don't have to go here to fight with them, to war, but for some reason this has not been mentioned in the media recently, or less than it's appropriate, I would say. So I think that it's not this issue of putting them in front of potential military attack, and I don't think that this is the issue that they are right now they are concerned. The issue is what kind of deal we can get from the United States and the West. And they are very good in bargaining, they are very good in negotiating, they have traditions that the West doesn't have in doing it, and they've achieved, I think, I would put it differently. I think that the United States and the West could have achieved better deal from what has been achieved 3 months ago. Because the Iran wanted this deal with the West even more than the West wanted to deal with Iran. So I'm not sure I'm giving you the answer to your question, but I think right now the main problem in Iran is how long and how far would the supreme leader allow Rouhani and Zarif
That's
to
the
go
main
on?
issue. Yep.
I believe that Zarif and Rouhani are sincere. But see what happened on the issue of appointing an ambassador to the UN. So that it's not that they are speaking with each other. They are speaking in different languages. Because in Iran, they are bilingual. You have Rouhani on one hand and Khamenei on the other hand. So it's really the question of understanding how long and how far would Khamenei would let them go. And so far, I'm not sure how much he will give, but I know one thing for sure, that initially at least, Rouhani got his permission to do what he has done from Khamenei. And if you look at hear what he said during this initial months in September, October, after his election, he said, we don't have time. Because back home, they are waiting for them with pressure that you have to show success, achievement. And if you look like just the last few days in the newspapers about the economic difficulties, you see that with all the discussion, removing part of the sanctions, the economic situation in Iran did not really improve.
Thank you, David. Nazanin Ansari, way in the back.
Hello, thank you very much to you both for very interesting and informative presentations. My question is to Professor Menashri. How do you view the Russian strategy and policy between Iran and P5+1 and America? And what do you think, how do you think this will be affected by the Ukrainian crisis? And how will Russia's position in Ukraine affect the considerations of Iran's leadership? And since you spoke about Mr. Abu Talebi's appointment to the UN, it seems that the appointment did not come from the foreign ministry, but rather the presidential office. Why would, I mean, if you have any more information about that, that would be great. But why do you think they would make such an appointment? Do you think that they think it was a mistake, or there was another reason for it? Thank you.
Let me one point of my previous discussion, and now everything is recorded, but I made a mistake. The one who wrote the book about fascist interpretation of Iran is Akbar Ganji, and not the person that I mentioned. I hope you will be able to at least remove the name of the person who did write the book. He has other qualities. Now, about the appointment of Abu Talebi, to be honest with you, I know that you don't expect someone who comes from that far to give a talk to tell you, I don't know. I fail to understand the rationale of picking up someone with such a record and which is to appoint to the, I think this is, if I give them the credit of calculating what they have done, it's to put in the United States in a very difficult position, the not being able to accept him and not being able to reject him because they are abide by the international law to accept ambassadors to the UN because it's not American prerogative to, from their, at least their view. But it would be similar if someone who appointed ambassador, I don't know where, someone who has been part of the coup in 1953 to simply to show the Iranians that we are doing something. We know they don't like it, but you have to digest it. I don't understand the rationale about it. Now, about the Russian policy, you know, the Iranians are very good in taking advantage of new opportunities. Basically, all their success in regional policy has been, in a way, taking advantage of collapse of systems around them, and they're penetrating into there. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Hezbollah even, with the fall of Lebanon as we knew it, Hamas and the Gaza Strip. By the way, many of these successes of Iranian policy has been basically due to the American good services to the Iranians. If you look about the United States, you see they are the great enemy, but they removed the enemy number one of Iran, Saddam Hussein, enemy number two, the Taliban. Now we come to Russia. Russia is not a natural ally of Iran from their ideology. If you look at the history of Russia and Iran and so on and so forth. But I think that Putin came to their help with Syria, and this continues, and I think that the policy of Putin on Iran and on the issue of the Middle East is serving Iranian interests. So they might be, they probably are very happy with such a big power like Russia, neighboring country, taking this kind of policy. But I think that Dana on this issue is more knowledgeable than I am.
Yeah, but I don't know the answer either. I mean, I don't know the extent to which, I was very intrigued what you said, David, about the possibility that Tehran needs a nuclear deal more than the United States does, and that this gives the U.S. maybe some leverage it may not even realize it has. We've had people on this podium, including Gary Seymour, who have raised the question, the great unknown raised by the Ukrainian crisis, which is in terms of U.S. or Iranian nuclear diplomacy. Does this give the Iranians a view that the pressure against them is going to be relieved, that they're going to have a greater scope for playing world powers off against each other? And that seems plausible, but to get into it, I'd refer to an Iran expert rather than myself. I mean, I think that, you know, this is one of those situations where it is in the interests of both Moscow and Washington and other capitals to try to quarantine their disagreements over Ukraine from general international diplomacy. And it therefore ought to be possible to do so. That doesn't mean it will be possible to do so.
Thanks, Dana.
Can I add a word here, not related to this question, but what the interpretation from what I said? I don't think I said that Iran wanted nuclear deal more than America wanted. Iran wanted a deal. The price was this was on the table. So they wanted, the main interest of Iran is to resolve the problem with this. But of course, the nuclear issue was the main issue.
Right.
So they want a sanctions
Relief.
deal.
That's it. That's what they
Okay.
wish.
We'll take two more questions. We're almost out of time here. Dr. Zahir Kazmi, Colonel Zahir Kazmi, and then in the front here, Dr. Mahmoud Ali. Did you have a question?
Thank you, Mark. My question is related to the first one that was asked, and it is for Dr. Dana Allen, that to what degree is the U.S. foreign policy towards Iran affected by its interest of balancing the power in Eurasia?
And then final question right up here in the front, Mahmoud Ali.
Thank you. Really, a question for you, Professor Manashri. Rhetorical exchanges between Israel and Iran have been, as we all know, quite visceral, non-rational, emotion-laden, quite tough. Is that all because of the nuclear issue alone, or is there more fundamental, cultural, historical antagonism since the Shah's fall? The question really is, if a nuclear deal is struck between the P5+1 and Iran, will relations between Iran and Israel become normal, but like other countries, like Jordan or Egypt and Israel? Or will it remain antagonistic the way it has been for the last few years? Thank you.
Thanks. Dana, why don't you go first, and then David, you can have the last word.
I may be too geopolitically unsophisticated to actually understand the question. I mean, obviously, U.S. policy towards Iran in recent years has had a lot to do with balancing Iran. I mean, in other words, providing reassurance and military support and security guarantees to Gulf Arab countries. And I think implicitly creating conditions, although this won't be this will now not be admitted to be U.S. policy, but implicitly creating conditions where if Iran developed nuclear weapons or developed, let's say, a nuclear capability short of nuclear weapons, that this would not inordinately alter the sort of psychological balance in the Persian Gulf, because U.S. military presence would be sufficient and sufficiently reassuring. When you speak about the balance in Eurasia, this involves strategic schemes which I'm not sure I can wrap my head around.
Okay. Don't talk about things you can't wrap your head around. That's a good answer. David.
I think that if you look at the history of Israel and Iran, of the Jews in Iran, it may be surprising to you. I think that Israelis have been educated to think about Iran positively. The only king in our Old Testament that is being mentioned favorably is King Cyrus the Great. These are now celebrating Passover, which is the Jewish holiday, which the freedom of the Jews. When we speak about liberties and freedom of the Jews, we always remember Cyrus the Great and granting liberty to the Jews to go and build the temple. And then we remember the last Shah of Iran, under which there was a honeymoon between Israel and Iran, and good relations between Iran and Israel. And you look at about Israelis, Iranians, Israelis, Jews who live in Israel, who came from Iran, they still remember Iran as their, I would almost say, homeland. I gave a lecture some years ago in a synagogue in Israel. I was the chairman of the Iranian Jewish Association in Israel to help the Jews who come from Iran. And after to new immigrants, I gave a long talk about Israel and Zionism. And one of the questions was, Professor Manashri, when do you think we can go back to our homeland? I thought this was really very disturbing to me. After 2,000 years, you came to your homeland, and then you ask when we can go to homeland. But the same way, I would say, I don't think that an Iranian citizen wakes up in the morning, and the first question that crosses his mind is, what can I do today to destroy the state of Israel? That's not the case. To people relations, this issue can be solved very easily. Is it because of the nuclear issue? It's partly it is, but I don't. I think that with the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, Israel did not, even when Ayatollah Khomeini came back to Iran and formed his government, Israel did not return its ambassador from Tehran, after the belief that maybe we can continue with the relations. Israel views Iran in its strategic interest is very close to Israel in the future. It takes leadership. Am I optimistic about this, that Iran will change its policy? I don't think so. Because I think that when Iran today has two major enemies in their ideology and two major aims or big targets that they sell to the people, and mostly to the United States and mostly to Israel. If Rouhani wants to put down a bit the one flag of the animosity towards the United States, he cannot go back again with Israel and do the same. He may even raise it higher. So I'm not optimistic about the near future. If you ask me any obstacles, strategic or others, historical, cultural, to have such relations, I think that I don't see obstacles. It would take few minutes to solve the problem as far as Israel is concerned. It's all up to the Iranians to decide that they want to accept a Jewish state in Israel. And so far, when you go on, say dead to Israel, I don't think it's possible. And if you add this kind of debt to Israel with the possibility of having nuclear power on the other hand, or the bomb on the other hand, this is something which it will be very difficult to any Israeli prime minister, any government to accept.
Thank you very much. Please, thank you all for joining this discussion meeting, which I thought was fascinating. Please join me in thanking Dr. David Ben-Asri and my fellow Dr. Dana.